Welcome to Worldbuilding Notes. In this episode, the Queens and their King. The life of a king begins the same as that of any average aristocratic boy. He is born to his mother, who is never a member of the royal family herself, and is not a member of the wealthier aristocracy either. So he grows up playing with his siblings, getting some basic education, being a child. But if the reigning king dies at the time when our aristocratic boy is in his teens, his family might decide to seize this opportunity. They know that 2-3 years after a king's death, a race to choose the next king is always held. For a family that belongs to the lower rungs of the aristocracy, there's a pretty big incentive to prepare one of their boys for that race. Every aristocratic woman of my imaginary river basin needs to have access to the queens. There are 12 of them at the moment, and they all have been fathered by the previous king, and their mothers once were queens, just as they are now. And all the queens possess a special power. The giant magical creature slumbering deep beneath the river basin this culture inhabits makes all women infertile by default. But this creature is also perfectly good-natured, so 2000 years ago, back when humans first ended up in this place, it picked a single woman to invest with the power to restore fertility in any woman she touched. All the queens ultimately descend from this woman, and her power has been passed down to them over the generations. When a queen reaches her middle age, she loses the ability to restore fertility, and instead becomes able to pass that power on to one of her daughters. And if she doesn't have any daughters, she can pass it on to one of the daughters of another queen, but not to anyone else. Though sometimes she can pass it on to not just one daughter, but 2, which is how the number of queens has grown from 1 to 12. But getting back to our ordinary aristocratic woman, she needs to be able to visit the royal palace and meet one of the queens in order to become fertile and be able to have children. All aristocratic women greet one another by holding hands and bowing towards one another. This greeting was first originated by the queens to get all the fertility restoration done and over with right there at the moment of greeting her visitor. But this fertility restoration has an expiration date. It lasts anywhere from 2 to 6 years, depending on the age of the queen, so an aristocratic woman needs to be able to get an audience with one of the queens every few years. And this applies to all aristocratic women of the land. For women from the lower ranks of the aristocracy, it can be an ordeal, so their families are always under a literal threat of extinction. But if one of the men from a woman's family is the king, she can visit the palace any time, under the excuse of paying him a visit, and be guaranteed to be welcomed on arrival by one of his wives, which is something she can then leverage to drag her family out of the lower rungs of aristocracy and benefit her family in the long term. So getting back to our teenage boy, if his family have decided to sign him up for the race that might make him king, then some preparations need to be done. The race will be held at one of the 21 monasteries of the land, but nobody knows which one at first. It's likely to involve only running, but it could also be swimming and running, or swimming and running up a long set of stairs, depending on the monastery involved. So if he can't swim or is a bad runner, then this needs to be fixed. The goal of the race is being the first one to reach the monastery, or, more precisely, the goal is reaching the inner courtyard of the monastery, where a huge flower blooms, and eating the fruit that sits at its center. The 21 flowers of the 21 monasteries all have their roots going down all the way to the magical creature underneath the basin, since this is also its doing. The healing powers of the queens are not something they can shut off, but while touching a woman will restore her fertility, touching a man will completely mess up his reproductive system and make him infertile instead. So the king needs to eat this fruit in order to be a husband to the queens. Once he does so, he will travel to the capital and be crowned as king by the youngest one of his wives, and he will be king for as long as at least one of his wives remains a queen. But after all of them, one by one, pass on their fertility-restoring powers and retire from their positions as queens, his tenure will be at its end. At that point, the king's daughters will have replaced his former wives as queens, and they will need a husband. But there can be only one king at a time, so their father will have to be helped along in meeting his death. But wait a minute, why would anyone put any effort into that race if this is how it's going to end? Who wishes for an untimely death? First off, there's family pressure, which cannot be overstated because the continued existence of the family is on the line. Second, he will inevitably be from the lower ranks of aristocracy, which in practice might mean that his family has just enough land to be able to mooch off the work of their peasants and send an appropriately sized tribute to the capital, but they might not be able to afford anything beyond that. But if he becomes king, there will not be a single man in the whole world who will be wealthier and more powerful than he will be. Plus, the participants in the race all have to be between 15 and 19 years old, and by the time their tenure ends, they will be in their late 40s. From the vantage point of a teenager, 40s might as well be 80s. Both are a distant old age that will take forever to reach, so a teenage boy might just put it all out of his mind, thanks to both the pressure and the benefits. And finally, he could of course tell himself, once the time to die comes, I'll just run. But once that time does come, it's very unlikely to actually happen. After the last one of the queens he married retires, she will tell about it to his executioners and not to him. He'll never even get the chance to run. But if his final wife does tell him about it, or he tries to run as soon as there's only one wife left, he might not have anywhere to run. Sheltering him is dangerous because if the people doing it get caught, they'll all be killed as well. And leaving the country is not a thing, because the entire continent outside the basin is a barren wasteland. There are no other countries. And even if he gets lucky enough to get away, it will be vitally important to find him. As I've mentioned, aristocratic women rely on the existence of the queens to remain fertile. And so do the peasant women, even though they don't meet the queens in person, and instead receive fertility-giving tokens that induce them to give birth to genetic clones of themselves. Without the royal family, the peasantry would disappear along with the aristocracy, and humanity would go extinct in the entire basin. The queens could continue the royal family by having children with ordinary men, and either not caring about the effect this has on those men's subsequent ability to reproduce, or using some way to get around it. But the people inhabiting this basin don't actually know about the existence of the giant magical creature deep underground, and they have their own explanations for everything. In their view, the queens are special due to their divine descent. The king is divine as well, and he is the source of their power to impart fertility. The queens would lose it without him, and it might seem like he's a different man every generation, but all those men are simply vessels for the spirit of a fertility god, which always comes back to the mortal realm in form of the fruit that the prospective king has to consume. And if he is the source of the queen's powers, then he is ultimately the source of all fertility in the basin, and this has been analogized to extend to everything that inhabits the land, from plants to animals. The king simply must be there for all the spring planting ceremonies, either within his mortal vessel or in his spirit form. Otherwise, the river basin will become just as dead as the world outside. So how likely is it that a queen or someone else will actually be willing to enable him to escape, or that anyone will help him to hide out, or that his conscience will not make him turn himself in? But all the various possibilities aside, if all goes according to plan, the king will be killed. His body will be chopped into 21 pieces, and each piece will be drained of blood, wrapped in cloth, and buried at one of the 21 monasteries, as the king's final act of fertilizing the land. And then, after a few years, one of the 21 flowers will bloom again, and the cycle will begin anew.